In November of 1890, a young black man from Massachusetts sat down and wrote a letter. He was 22 years old. He had already graduated from Fisk University, one of the nation's most distinguished historically black universities. He was enrolled at Harvard. He was, by any measure, one of the most brilliant young minds in America, and he needed money for graduate school. The man he was writing to, the man who controlled the money he needed, was one of the most complicated and controversial figures in the entire history of America. Rutherford B. Hayes, the 19th President of the United States, the man who ended Reconstruction. This is the story of that letter, and what it cost Du Bois to send it, and what it ultimately produced. To understand why this story is so remarkable and so complicated, you have to go back 13 years before that letter was written, to 1877. The presidential election of 1876 was one of the most contested in American history. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes faced Democrat Samuel Tilden. The results were disputed in 3 southern states. Neither man had enough certified electoral votes to claim the presidency. Hayes would receive the presidency. In exchange, federal troops would be withdrawn from the former Confederate states. Those troops were the only thing standing between black Americans and the organized white supremacist violence that had never accepted their freedom. Without those troops, everything that had been built during Reconstruction was vulnerable. The black elected officials who had served in state legislatures and in Congress, removed by force and by fraud. The black voters who had exercised their constitutional rights, terrorized away from the polls. The schools that black communities had built with their own hands and their own money, burned. The promise of Reconstruction, broken. Rutherford B. Hayes made the deal that made all of this possible. This is the man W.E.B. Du Bois needed to write to in 1890. But history, as it always does, refuses to be simple. Because the same Rutherford B. Hayes who had dismantled Reconstruction was, by 1882, doing something that complicated his legacy considerably. In 1882, a Connecticut textile magnate named John Fox Slater donated $1 million, an extraordinary sum in any era, specifically for the education of formerly enslaved people and their descendants in the American South. $1 million to educate black Americans. The fund would go on to support some of the most important black educational institutions in America, Tuskegee Institute, Hampton Institute, and dozens of others. By 1931, it would distribute over $2 million to black education, and Rutherford B. Hayes, the man who had ended Reconstruction, was chosen to chair it. The man who had taken away black America's political protection was now responsible for funding black America's intellectual development. There is no clean way to make sense of that. History does not offer clean ways. What it offers is the truth, in all its contradictions and complexities. It is November 1890. W.E.B. Du Bois is 22 years old. He is enrolled at Harvard, one of very few black students to have ever gained admission, but he has no clear path to the graduate funding he needs to complete his doctorate. Someone hands him a clipping from the Boston Herald. The clipping reports on a speech Hayes had given at Johns Hopkins University about the Slater Fund. Hayes had announced that the fund would underwrite the European education of, and these are his words, any young colored man in the South whom we find to have a talent for art or literature. But Hayes had also added something else. He said it was very doubtful such a Negro existed. He said their chief and almost only gift had been oratory. The chairman of the Fund for Black Education was telling the world, in a public speech at a major university, that black intellectual talent beyond oratory was so rare as to barely exist. Du Bois read that newspaper clipping. He later wrote, "No thought of modest hesitation occurred to me." 2 days later, he wrote the letter. In his first letter, Du Bois announced himself directly to former President Hayes. He outlined his educational background, Fisk University, Harvard, his academic accomplishments, and his plans for doctoral study. He presented himself as precisely the kind of young man the Slater Fund claimed to be looking for, The response came back quickly. Hayes informed him that what he had read in the newspaper was incorrect. The Slater Fund had provided scholarships in the past. It was not currently doing so. The door had been closed. W.E.B. Du Bois did not accept that answer. He wrote a second letter. This time he did not ask politely. He told the former president of the United States, plainly, directly in writing, that his change of plan did not seem fair or honest. He then wrote the sentence that may be the most precise indictment of the limits of white philanthropy toward black education ever committed to paper. I find men willing to help me through cheap theological schools. I find men willing to help me use my hands before I have got my brains in working order. I have an abundance of good wishes on hand, but I never found a man willing to help me get a PhD. He was not being ungrateful or reckless. He was being precise. The system, the philanthropic infrastructure that claimed to support black advancement, was willing to fund black people into usefulness, into service, into just enough education to be productive but not enough to be powerful. It was not willing to fund black intellectual excellence on its own terms. And a 22-year-old black man from Massachusetts had just said so, in writing, to a former president of the United States. In May of 1891, the Slater Fund Board met and did not grant aid to Du Bois or to any other applicants that year. Funds were limited. Applications were denied. Du Bois was hurt, and he said so, writing a letter to Hayes that challenged the former president's integrity directly, accusing him of misleading black applicants about the fund's actual availability. Hayes could have dismissed him. He was a former president of the United States. Du Bois was a 22-year-old black graduate student with no institutional power and no political allies. Hayes could have taken offense at the impertinence, ended the correspondence, and moved on. He did not do any of those things. Understanding Du Bois' disappointment, Hayes chose not to retaliate. He encouraged the young man to renew his application. In the following year, with Hayes actively supporting his application, the Slater Fund trustees voted Du Bois a grant of $375 plus a loan for the same amount, $750, half gift, half loan. It was not a fortune, but it was enough. Du Bois later wrote about the moment he received the news. He remembered rushing down to New York to meet with former President Hayes in person at the old Astor House Hotel. He described emerging from that meeting as feeling on air. He wrote that after that meeting he saw a shirt in a shop window that he particularly liked. He went in and asked about it. The man who would spend his entire life fighting for black liberation, who would co-found the NAACP, write the souls of black folk, become the most important black intellectual of the 20th century, stopped to look at a shirt in a shop window because for one moment the weight had lifted. He sailed for Germany. He studied at Friedrich Wilhelm University in Berlin under some of the greatest scholars in the world. He learned methodologies and frameworks that transformed how he understood race, capitalism, colonialism, and the global dimensions of black oppression. He returned to America in 1894. In 1895, he became the first black person to earn a doctoral degree from Harvard University. What W.E.B. Du Bois built on the foundation of that $750 fellowship changed American history. The Souls of Black Folk, published in 1903, introduced the concept of double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, the two-ness of being black in America. It is one of the most important books ever written on American soil. The NAACP, co-founded by Du Bois in 1909, SAL, became the most important civil rights organization in American history. The Crisis magazine, edited by Du Bois for 24 years, reached hundreds of thousands of black readers with rigorous journalism, political analysis, and literary culture that told black stories with the intellectual seriousness they deserved. The Philadelphia Negro, published in 1899, was the first systematic sociological study of a black American community ever conducted. It established the methodology that would define American sociology for generations. Du Bois lived to 95 years old. He fought for black freedom from the 1890s until his death in 1963, the day before the March on Washington. He never accepted that the world as it was the world as it had to be. His work, every book, every organization, every article, every speech, every act of intellectual resistance, built on a foundation that included $750 from the John F. Slater Fund, administered by the man who had ended Reconstruction. This story does not have a simple moral. The consequences of the 1877 Compromise, Jim Crow, mass disenfranchisement, the century of terror that followed, cannot be undone by any act of philanthropy. And yet, the fund he chaired distributed millions of dollars to black educational institutions at a moment of existential crisis for black intellectual life. He championed the application of a young black man who had publicly challenged his integrity. He chose not to retaliate against someone who had every reason to be angry and no institutional power to protect himself. History does not deal in saints and villains. It deals in human beings making choices, some which cause enormous harm and some which contribute to genuine good. History offers a view of the full truth, all of it, to help us understand how we arrived at the present moment. W.E.B. Du Bois found a man willing to help him get a Harvard PhD. It just took 2 letters. One rejection, one refusal to accept that rejection as final, and the willingness of a 22-year-old black man to tell a former president of the United States in writing that his behavior was neither fair nor honest. That was always going to be W.E.B. Du Bois.